Who were critics? There are some big names here in the critic list of the empire. Yes? No? Yes?
Mm-hmm.
You're right. There will be some critics of everything.
Yeah. There were a few critics.
There were a few critics of the empire?
Mm-hmm. It says it right here.
Okay. But who were the major critics? There were some major critics.
Oh, William Jennings Bryan.
William Jennings Bryan.
Jane Addams, Mark Twain.
Right. Some big names who were definitely critics of expansionism, right? Anti-imperialist. Why were they critics?
Oh, because they thought it was violating the Declaration of Independence.
Right, and the Constitution. Okay. So, you have two camps, and you have the people in the middle who are going, we just really want to have some money, and we want to be able to buy things, and we want to have a decent life. Right? So, do you see that in today's society? What do you think, Brianna? How so, do you think? How do you see that in today's society? If you have the critics and the anti-imperialists, and then you have the people who just want to survive. They just want to have a decent life. They want to put food on the table. How do you see that play out today? Okay. So are you talking like class systems?
Yeah.
Okay. Like an economic class, like the lower class, the middle class, and the upper class? Right. So the middle class was really, they weren't necessarily the ones who were huge proponents. Jane Addams was a huge proponent. Okay, so portions of the middle class were able to do that. But the lower class, were they able to do that? Did they have the luxury of being able to do that? Most of them were working how many hours at this time? Yeah, 9.5, 10 hours a day, generally 6 days a week, right? Yeah. So you'll see that, and when you, as you go through life, look and see who's able to be the person who's advocating for X, Y, or Z. Because you see that, and it does transcend classes, but in general, it's the people who have more time and more resources who have the ability to do that, right? I mean, look at, say, Leonardo DiCaprio. He dumps millions of dollars into environmental issues, right? Although he flies his own plane, which is what critics talk about with him, right? But you'll find some of the biggest names who are behind some of these movements have the resources to do that. It's not always the poor who are doing it. When they're doing it because, one, 30 of them just died in a mining accident, or 50 of them just died on a railroad, right? Okay, so as they're arguing amongst themselves, you have the guerrilla war going on in the Philippines between 1898 and 1902. And why were they fighting the United States? They had fought Spain, and now they're fighting the United States. Why? The guerrillas had fought Spain up till 1898. Now they're fighting the United States. Why is that?
The guerrillas
In the Philippines.
because the United States came in and won the Philippines. They tried to take over. They took over the Philippines.
Whoever comes after them, it doesn't matter who. They want to defend where they are.
They were fighting for their own independence, right? And then it comes down, they sign the Treaty of Paris, and what happens? Then they belong to the United States, right? So the guerrillas are like, no, we're not going to stop fighting. we this isn't what we signed up for, right? And so it was Emilio Aguinaldo, okay, who had organized this independence movement from Spain. And then when the Spanish surrendered, they declared, or they proclaimed Filipino independence, and they drafted this democratic constitution, but the United States said no, because in the Treaty of Paris, the United States was awarded or paid for the Philippines, right? So the United States put down the fighting through 1902, and then there were some Senate investigations because there was talk of torture and burning villages and things that the United States military were accused of doing, as well as the guerrillas. But they had an investigation and found out that at least some of them were true, and they changed the status of the Philippines by creating the Philippine Government Act, where the Governor General was appointed by the President, okay? But a Filipino elected assembly, and it would lead to eventual self-government, okay? The only reason that was done is because the Filipinos wouldn't stop fighting, and the United States wasn't going to continue to fight, okay? And so, when did they actually become independent? I don't remember if the book said it or not. 46. So, it was in protective status, okay? So, kept under United States control. The same as Cuba, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. Alright? So, the United States didn't feel that they were able to control their own, I guess, destiny. Not necessarily their own destiny, but their own affairs. They weren't fit to control their own affairs. Okay? Any questions? Does that make sense? So moving on to chapter 21. Yeah, the progressive movement. The reform movement. Was it a large movement? Huge. Huge. Did it take over pretty much everything? It did. It really did. Okay, so 1900 to 1917, the many phases of progressivism. So this wave of reform, and reform in all manner of society, was termed the progressive movement. Okay? So when you think of reform and progressivism, you think of them as being tied together. So this was, in some historical references talked about as the people, or the common people, triumphing over the evil corporations. Okay? But it was more than that, as historians continue to study it. It was also a series of special interest groups who were promoting specific reforms. All right? So, like racism. Okay, they were working on racism. Anti-immigrant. Coercive social control. All right? So you look at it, and you have historians now who are arguing over what they all mean. Right? What does progressivism mean? Do you think they'll ever define it? I mean, you take any of these movements in history. Can Brianna and Garrick come up with a term for that time period, and can you pinpoint and wholly explain that era? No, you're never going to be able to wholly explain something, because you are a historian. And although you look back, and you look back on it with unbiased eyes, right? You leave your biases, you leave your interpretation, but it's still interpreted, isn't it? Even through that. Okay? All right, so there's likely, if you are trying to pinpoint a term for progressivism, reform is the best term. Now, the reasons behind the reform is up to interpretation, and that's where you have the critics and the historians arguing over what it really means, or why it really happened. Okay? So, progressives were really centered where? Urban or rural? Urban, very good. And they went from grassroots to a national movement or era, right? So they started within the neighborhoods, they started with the bosses, they started in certain regions of different cities. Okay? And so, was this also international? Yes?
And everybody was catching up with the times, to say, trying to stay with the times as far as inventions and technology.
Mm-hmm. It was. So you have a lot of progressive movement here. And so this growing middle class in the U.S. cities changed society. You have the changing middle class, you have the influx, and it's more than an influx, isn't it? Of immigrants. What's that? It's millions, yes. I mean, these cities are being inundated with new ideas, new people, new language, new food, new everything, right? And so the reformers say, well, we don't like some of that, right? Or we don't agree with some of that. We're going to work on changing that. Okay, so what were some of the reform movements that this chapter talks about? Everybody name one.
Well, here's a question. Why is this all happening in this time rather than a century before? Or, like, why is all of a sudden this almost, I guess, like technology and cultural leap happening right now? Why not 20 years before?
Well, a lot of it, most of it has to do with the huge influx of immigrants and the changes in the city, because they had to do something with all the people. They had to do something. People were dying of typhoid. And, I mean, thousands of people were getting sick, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they had to do something. And the people who had been previously in control didn't want to lose that control. Remember, we're coming out of the Victorian age where it's very rigid, okay? And people are kind of bumping up against that.
Mm-hmm.
But in this age, when you have so many people, that population, that native-born population, is now losing more and more control. And they're seeing their cities just explode. They don't even know the cities any longer. And so that's what was really the catalyst for these movements, is this influx of people changing things so rapidly that people wanted to slow it down. Okay? Did it ever slow down? It slows down in a way that it changes focus. So yes, just like you saw after the Civil War, you saw Reconstruction just ramping up, and then the economy takes a dive, right? Well, then there goes Reconstruction, right? So you see this progressivism rising and rising and rising in reform, and then now what's next? What happens in about 1917? World War I. So that changes the focus. So yes, it, and the World War, not a lot of reform. There's reform. They're trying to reform the economics, and they're trying to reform the policies and politics in Europe. So it does take on new meaning. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right, so getting back, name me some of the reform movements. Savannah. During this time, during the progressive time, what was one of them that they were working on? Fire safety, absolutely. Brianna.
Was it
Food and drug, very good. Did anyone read the Jungle?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Garrick.
The Anti-Saloon League.
The Anti-Saloon League. Yes. Aiden.
Women's Christian Temperance League.
Okay. Pretty much the same thing, right?
Yeah,
Temperance. Right? Alcohol. Anti-alcohol.
there was music.
Yes, and there was music.
Time.
Right. Right. There were, it stretched over the arts, it stretched over health. It hit and focused on a lot of different areas. Jim Crow laws, yeah. Yeah. It was. When you take it and break it down like that and start naming different things, you're like, wow, what happened? What happened? And why did like your question, Aiden, why did it explode now? Okay? So, the white-collar workforce jumped. It doubled from 5.1 million to 10.5 million during this time, between 1900 and 1920. Okay? So, over double the growth rate in the labor force as a whole. And that's white-collar. So, that's changing society, because now you have higher pay, you have different pay, and you have different jobs that didn't even exist, right? When you graduate from high school, by the time you're 25, there will be jobs that don't exist today. You do realize that, right? Yeah. It's kind of mind-boggling, to really break it down and go, oh, I'm training for jobs that don't even exist today. It's true. That's what schools and K-12 has been focusing on for the last 5-10 years. And how do you train? How do you do that? That's a great question. That has not yet been answered. They just do their best. So, this was also happening at this time. You have a growth in civil engineers, lawyers, teachers, accountants, business owners, corporate executives. All right? So you have this growing class, these professional groups that are now coming into being, like the American Association of University Professors. Okay? Remember, voluntary associations. Who was all about voluntary associations? De Tocqueville, yes. You had it right, Brianna. You're in French. You had it right. Okay, so women were involved in reform. Men were involved in reform. Blacks were involved in reform. It didn't matter what class you were or what your ethnicity was. Most people were involved in reform, either the subject of the reform or the proponent of the reform. Right? Religion. Right? Gets down to temperance. It has a lot to do with it. Okay, so the urban immigrant political machines and workers. So workers were asking for a reform, as well as the leaders. So one of the big pushes for the safety, the fire safety, was, do you remember the name of the fire, the famous fire in New York City? The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. Yeah, there were a lot of problems here, especially in 1911. So, if you recall, in Lowell, they would bar the doors so women couldn't get out. Well, then you had a fire and nobody could get out. Okay? It was, there's a reason we now have OSHA. OSHA is the Occupational Safety Hazard. What's the A stand for? Maybe association. It doesn't sound right, but.
Annoyance.
What's that?
Annoyance.
Annoyance. Okay, so they now have rules and regulations, Savannah, that say you can do this, you can't do that. Okay? Now, OSHA comes in and says that, what is it? Whiteout? Whiteout is a hazardous material, so you have to have a page listing what the hazardous material is. So every school room over there has to have a book saying what the hazardous materials are. Whiteout is one of them. Okay, so we've gone from the shirt.
Material?
Yes, whiteout is a hazardous, according to OSHA.
What's hazardous about white?
It's the chemicals in it.
Protecting the black race. So
Aided.
Wow.
Aided. Aided. So we go from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire to whiteout as being a hazardous material in a classroom or in an office. Okay? So you have a lot of span there, right? That's a lot of change. But you go back to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire and you say, they really needed to do something, right? Women, they have photos of women on the ground, on the sidewalk because they jumped. They couldn't get out. All right, so emotional photographs like that helped push the cause. The workers pushed the cause, and then the urban political machines, they would also push some of the causes, because then if the factories had to pay for that, then the machines didn't necessarily have to pay, right? But they also, in some realm, on some levels, actually did care about the people that they were, that were under them.
Problem is they didn't know when to stop.
Ah,
And now,
kind of like
why
your
not?
last comment. Yes. Not okay, Aiden, not okay. Okay, so a lot of women were becoming involved in this. A lot of women were working, okay? The number of women working, single women working, tripled during this time. And let's see, what else? What else can we say about progressivism? That you had academics, you had social theorists, you had journalists, city dwellers, workers,
public health.
you had public health. You saw this with the urbanization and with the immigration. You saw a divergence of the classes, and so you had a greater span, a greater gap in that. So these class divisions were becoming more and more prominent. Right? And the reformers were not necessarily all radicals. Okay? They were requesting things, they were trying to change things, but they didn't necessarily, the majority of them were not radicals. Okay? And radicals, when I mean radicals, that would be people today, for instance, who would blow up a building to make a point, to create a reform. Right? So, they also, in progressivism, studied the issues. They had statistics on them. And it was from an academic standpoint, from a statistical data, we're going to prove that this reform needs to be done with this information. Okay? So that was really popular. And so they believed that they could solve most of the problems through study and organized effort. Now, previous to this, Hull House, remember Hull House, they were working on what they believed were the problems. And they were hitting some of the problems, but they didn't hit all the problems, and they didn't hit the actual root of the problem. They were sometimes only taking care of the symptoms. Reformers are trying to, with their data, they're like, okay, maybe with data we can hit the root of the problem. Okay? And you'll find throughout your life that oftentimes the root of the problem and the solution and the symptoms don't always align. Okay? Alright, so the photo here of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.
Shirtwaist being shirt and skirt?
Well, it was a garment building. Okay, so intellectuals are offering new social views. So the social Darwinism intensified after 1900. Remember, social Darwinism was where the state owes its citizens nothing but basic political rights, order, and law. They don't owe them if you happen to die on a railroad, working on a railroad. Okay? So, natural laws were controlling the social order. Okay? Which justified unrestrained economic competition. And it was being attacked by people like the social gospel leaders, Edward Bellamy, Lester Ward. Okay? Economists like Thorstein Veblen with the theory of the leisure class. All right? And it's funny because he writes about what we now call conspicuous consumption, right? People building mansions, throwing these lavish parties, throwing it in people's faces. How is that different than today's society? In many ways, it's not different than what you see in today's society. Not necessarily here in Glen Helen, Alaska, or in Valdez, Alaska, but you go to California, live in California. It's all about what car you drive and what you look like. You go to DC and you walk around and it's all about what car you drive and where you live.
There's a lot of nice cars in DC.
There are many nice cars in DC. And you go to New York, it's all about what jewelry you're wearing, or what clothing you're wearing, or what stores you frequent. Okay? And we've talked a little bit about that before. So, economist Thorstein Veblen was writing about it. And he said, hey, you know, this is not okay. Philosopher William James out of Harvard, okay, he's talking about, obviously, philosophy, but the truth from experience of coping with life's realities through political action. Journalism, okay, the promise of American life that was written by Herbert Crowley, okay, that the government should promote the welfare of all. Jane Addams was writing about the settlement house movement and democracy and social ethics, right? So the individual's well-being depends on what? This was our quote one day not long ago. You remember? It depends on the well-being of all. Okay? So that's not social Darwinism, right? That's the progressives moving in and saying, you know what, this social Darwinism isn't working for us. Okay, so education reformer John Dewey saw schools as an agent for change. Okay, not the first one to see schools as an agent for change, and not the last one to see schools as an agent for change. Okay, Hitler was one of the major proponents of schools and youth as an agent for change, right? Dewey wrote Democracy in Education and in Chicago. Lawyer Oliver Wendell Holmes. Has anyone ever heard of Oliver Wendell Holmes? No? Supreme Court Justice. Becomes a Supreme Court Justice. So you take the people from Hull House, you take the women who were working there, you take Oliver Wendell Holmes, you take these young activists, progressives, and bump that up 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and what do you have? No, not necessarily dead, but you have people who are taking those views of the progressive era and bringing them forward. You have a Supreme Court justice, and those views are going to be used on the court, right? So you have lasting effects from progressivism way past the progressive 1917. Okay? All right, so as they're spotlighting these social problems, okay, they are writing about, and they're going into the slums. They're writing about the slums. Okay, these are the middle class going into the lower class areas and writing about it. So you've heard about it, you've heard some about it, but generally you don't travel in the same circles, right? I mean, you see that anywhere you live. People may or may not go into the slums. Most people try to avoid going into slums when they go to a different city, right? Could be dangerous. These journalists were going in and they were writing accounts of what it was like for the people. They were writing accounts about the kids. All right, you saw the pictures of the kids there playing on the garbage. What do you call it? The big garbage.
Cans.
Yeah, the garbage cans, but dumpsters. Thank you. Duh. Okay. Yes. So, they were chronicling corporate wrongdoing, municipal corruption, the industrial abuses. You had the strong push from industry and business, and people are now, because of the immigrants and because they are being stirred up and seeing these images, they're going, we're going to stop it. We're going to do something. The Financier was written about a tycoon without a social conscience. Okay? Some of the industry leaders from the 1800s, from the late 1800s, were seen as leaders without a conscience. Okay? The Octopus talked about the California Railroad barons. So, as they're writing it, it's questioning the elite. It's questioning the corporate structure. It's questioning those who are at the highest class. Okay? So, it stimulated pressure for tougher business regulation. Okay? When you look at the smoke from the Industrial Revolution and you look at the buildings, it is really bad. I mean, those buildings were just covered in soot. So think about breathing all that all the time. I mean, your great-grandfather died of the black lung from working in the coal mines that were unregulated. But that was simply the way it was done, though. I mean, it was Chmielowski. Yeah. So, muckrakers, Teddy Roosevelt was criticizing the muckrakers, but then the muckrakers, because he criticized them, the muckrakers were seen as a badge of honor. It was something that people could hold on to and go, I am a muckraker. So, there. Do what I say. Okay? So, as the critics are coming out on both sides, you have this movement that is gaining momentum, right? And as your journalists are going undercover, your artists are also going into and drawing and painting and photographing not just the slums, but even everyday life in America. Okay? You've seen where they've gone from the Hudson River Valley paintings. Remember the Hudson Valley paintings? Okay? Beautiful, expansive, wilderness. And then you have people painting people who are working and tired and exhausted after working 9.5, 10, 11 hours a day. Right? So it spotlights different things. Your Hudson River painters spotlighted something different that they wanted to protect and people to acknowledge at the time, right? Remember the wilderness? The Ash Can School is doing the same during this time. Okay, so reforming local politics, initiatives, referendums, recall petitions, these are all brand new. But you should be familiar with them because you can, sorry, I have to stand up. You can sign a recall petition for somebody who's been elected. Right? Okay, has anybody ever, is anybody probably not 18 yet? No? Are you 18 yet? Not quite? Okay, so you have to be 18 to sign it legally, you know, for it to count. I mean, you could sign it, but it just won't count. But that's a process that they developed because of the corrupt governments that they had at this time. Okay? And so you had seen where the elites were trying to attack Tammany Hall in New York. And Tammany Hall is a great one to pick on because it was so corrupt and so blatantly corrupt and so large. All right. So the Protestant clergy and the Protestant clergy was attacking, the elites were attacking, okay? But it was a democratic organization. It was the Democrats who were in charge at this time in Tammany Hall, okay? But they had a lot of immigrants, right? And so the reformers were trying to battle the corruption in the city governments. And so the city governments kind of morphed, and that's another reason that they actually got behind new regulations for the shirt tail fire and OSHA and different other regulations, is because they could see that it was going to be helpful for them to retain some power if they could morph a little bit and go for some of those reforms. Because the reformers were really hitting it hard and they were being successful. Okay? So, in San Francisco, they were convicting bosses in San Francisco. And the attorney, Hiram Johnson, who led that, actually was voted in as the governor of California and then into the U.S. Senate. Okay? Toledo, the Sam Golden Rule Jones case. All right? So they were really working on in many of these different cities. Right? So it was going beyond the bosses. It was going to the roots. It was these private monopolies that they were trying to start regulations for. And these monopolies were running the city water, the city sewer, the city electric. So they had control over almost everything within the city. Right? I mean, if you have the infrastructure, if you're monopolizing the infrastructure and you have that power, then it gives you a great deal of power, right? And so that's where they were trying to curb that power, that political power, because it garnered political power. And this is also when city managers were starting to be hired instead of appointed mayors, because they thought that as a city manager you could be more less inclined to bend to the political will. Okay? Business interests for a manager, so it would also give the elites, however, more clout if it was run more like a business. Okay? But your electoral reform comes in where now you have pre-printed ballots. You have secret ballots. And it was last class where we had the current event where in Vermont or New Hampshire they were complaining because now they couldn't take a picture of the ballot that they had just voted, right? So you're coming full circle again. Okay, so yay, we get secret ballots, so nobody knows who we're voting for, and so we can vote the way we really want to. And now you have people angry that they can't show their secret ballot to people, right? So you see how things cycle back? No, we don't have people threatening us with guns in general, but there are districts who vote 100% for one candidate. That seems to create some controversy.
Wasn't that Philadelphia? The whole city of Philadelphia?
I don't remember. I just remember the controversy that there were certain districts who were voting 100% for one candidate, and that is very unusual. I would be highly there were other things. There had to have been other things going on, because you never have 100% of the people agree, ever, right? So your initiative, you could instruct a legislature to consider special and specific bills, okay, with initiatives. With a referendum, you can enact a law or express your views on a proposed measure. And a recall petition where you could remove someone from office with enough signatures. All right? These were brand new. These are part of the very fabric of what you will soon be able to use as voters in this nation and in this state. Right? Totally new for during this time. Right? But it was reformed because local politics and state politics and on up to national politics, you remember the corruption, right? Remember how they were all the parties were accusing each other of corruption, okay? From the very neighborhood to the national level, okay? That's why these were passed. As they were passed, your party loyalty weakened. Okay? Why is that?
You start second guessing.
You start asking more questions. Right. And your political bosses aren't telling you exactly how to vote anymore, are they? Because they don't have quite as much power. They still have a lot of power, but they don't have quite as much power. Right? And we're going to stop here because it's time for you to go.